Hello, I'm U.S. Secretary of Transportation Pete Buttigieg, and I want to thank everyone attending for your work to reinforce the ties that bind us along the largest shared border in the world. And of course, we share a lot more than just a border. As President Biden said during his visit to Ottawa recently, quote, "Americans and Canadians are two people, two countries sharing one heart," end quote. We share values, we share family connections, we share economic outcomes, we share a changing climate. In so many ways, we share a future and a fate. That's not to say there aren't differences, which is one of the reasons why constructive dialogues, like the ones you're having at this event, are so important. For my part, I want to say a few words about the future of the US-Canada relationship as it relates to transportation and supply chains. Canada is our top trading partner, with more than $2.5 billion in trade crossing the border every day, supporting millions of jobs in both countries. It is essential that movement between the US and Canada, by every mode of transportation, for people and goods, is smooth, efficient, and resilient. That is exactly what we are working to achieve, engaging closely with Transport Canada and with my counterpart and friend, Minister Omar Alghabra. In our skies, we've worked with Canada from the early days of COVID, when we coordinated on health protections for passengers and crew. A little over a year ago, following Russia's brutal and unprovoked invasion of Ukraine, our nations acted swiftly to bar Russian aircraft from our airspace. And in recent months, we've coordinated on everything from sustainable aviation to airspace safety around potential espionage balloons. When it comes to our roads, President Biden and Prime Minister Trudeau committed to aligning electric vehicle policies, supply chains, and chargers so that people can seamlessly drive between our countries in the vehicles of the future, and so that the production of those vehicles builds on the integrated cross-border auto industry that provides so many good jobs for Americans and Canadians alike. On our supply chains, we've coordinated as the pandemic and climate change have caused serious shipping disruptions around the world and across North America. We're improving data sharing so that the different players in supply chains can move goods more efficiently. And we're investing in physical infrastructure, including on the Great Lakes St. Lawrence Seaway that the US and Canada share. When the Seaway opened 64 years ago, Queen Elizabeth II was in attendance and described the Seaway as, quote, "a highway which will open the middle of this continent to the commerce of the world," end quote. And she was right. Today, an average of 38 million metric tons of cargo pass through the Seaway annually. And one of our current shared projects with Canada is facilitating a green shipping corridor network along the Seaway, which will help fight climate change and provide a model for international maritime cooperation around the world. The list goes on, but I offer these examples to reinforce the importance of what you all are doing at this convening. When the US succeeds, Canada succeeds. When Canada succeeds, the US succeeds. The world that we want to pass on to our children is one where a strong, prosperous United States is closer than ever to a strong, prosperous Canada. Thank you all, and I look forward to hearing about the outcomes of this event.
Good morning to you all. You just heard Secretary Buttigieg talk about the need to coordinate our country's transportation and infrastructure. He spoke of adapting to a changing world, where it's pointing to the need for integrated policies, in this case around EVs. Now that's going to take a lot of infrastructure development. EVs in many cases are going to require mass expansion of our grids, which is not just a federal issue in Canada, but a provincial issue and a municipal issue. And we just witnessed how well governments work together, brackets or not, in managing a germ, where we couldn't agree on how to do that. How are we going to agree to build the infrastructure around emissions that's necessary? Now that's just one example of infrastructure that's come up. We've also got, obviously today, we need to talk about internet connectivity, our digital pay systems, and our cybersecurity needs as well. We've heard those phrases of friendshoring and nearshoring. It means different things to different people. Sometimes it means America shoring, depending on where you are. And we've been standing up for Canada here to make sure that that's not the case. But it's put a bright light on traditional infrastructure, whether we're talking about roads, train tracks, ports, pipelines. They're still a very significant part of our infrastructure needs. And so I'm going to pick up on what Ian said as we open up the panel. Ian asked whether we are fit for purpose. And I think what he means really is, our democracies fit for purpose when we're actually declining in quantity over the last 25 years. There are less democracies today than there were. How conducive are democracies and the structures we have to help build the infrastructure that we need to create a competitive North America to take on a very competitive global environment? And so the question I want to launch off with, and Francis is going to give us a broad strokes of this, is how prepared are we to meet the infrastructure demands of the 21st century?
That's a big question, Goldie. I have to tell you, I've never been invited to an infrastructure panel before. This is my first. Hundreds of panels, never invited to infrastructure. And I think it's because economists are very boring with their typical approach.
But you're not.
They always say the same things, right? You're going to hear first, well, the fiscal multiplier on infrastructure is high, therefore it's good. We have tons of studies that tell us $1 of government spending on infrastructure gives us $3 of GDP growth. So that's a standard trope. You'll hear economists in every type of report tell you we just don't have enough. There are reports saying that in the next 15 years, we're missing infrastructure that could add $10 trillion to growth in the United States, with commensurate reports coming out of Canada. And you'll also hear economists talk about things like social infrastructure, education, childcare as being really critical components that we simply don't have. So that was all the content I had for this, and then I started to panic, and I thought, oh, well, I wish that I could talk about the things that economists are really talking about in the news, like labor shortages, huge problem. We have not, in our modern economy, experienced labor shortages like we do right now. Did you know 40% of Americans and Canadians over the age of 15 do not work for a variety of reasons? 40% not there. And I was speaking with my co-panelists in the green room, also talking about labor shortages being an issue. What about productivity? We're just not doing as much with what we have, and productivity has been declining for decades. It's especially problematic in Canada. And then deglobalization, huge issue, not just since COVID, but actually in 2016, we started talking about deglobalization. We were looking at world average tariffs that peaked in the 1930s with Smoot-Hawley and then declined over that period. Everything we've learned about the economy is based on the concept of globalization accelerating, not moving in the other direction. And then, of course, ESG transitions. How are we going to move towards this green economy? And I thought, oh, I wish that's what I was going to talk about. And then it occurred to me that the organizers of this conference know exactly what they're doing, because the solution to all of these major modern problems is infrastructure. Infrastructure is where we should coming back to every single time when we talk about these problems. And my concern, Goldie, is that we are probably heading into a recession. Doesn't feel like it right now, but all of our leading indicators tell us that that's where we'll be by the end of this year in the US and Canada. My concern is that we're going to be so focused on the urgency of that we're going to forget the real cure for what is ailing our North American economies really is infrastructure. That this should really be exactly what the first thing economists talk about every time they get on a stage.
Great segue to you, Greg, because infrastructure is what you do, and you do it on both sides of the border. We have a case study of what happens if you don't get it right. We saw in Europe, if that transition that's underway is not planned, if it's not orderly, and certainly not affordable, you get a pretty big blowback from the public. How well positioned are we in North America to have a planned and orderly and affordable transition?
Well, Goldie, first of all, thanks to Daryl and Ian for putting this on. I think these conversations are great. We are well positioned if we take advantage of the position we're in. And, you know, when you think about Canada and the United States, trade between the two countries, energy takes up the largest portion of that goods trade, 22% of that, right? So we're in a great position to be able to fuel all the needs that we have here. And I'm coming from a perspective, just so people know, talking my own book in some respects, right? So Enbridge moves 20% of all the natural gas, 30% of all the oil, serves 15 million people in this province. So if you have a furnace or a gas stove, or you're in the steel business or the auto business or the power business, and I can go on and on, that's because of the business that we have here. But we're also a top 10 developer of renewables. So that all sounds great, 5 countries, 40 provinces, 40 states and 8 provinces. The problem is we're not taking advantage of it largely for one reason, not the commodity. You know, simple supply and demand on the commodity. There's plenty of it here in North America. The problem is permitting. So the most expensive energy almost on the planet on Christmas Day and Christmas Eve this year was in New England at $2,400 a megawatt hour, right? So that's $24 a kilowatt. which you think about what your own bill would be here in Ontario and throughout most of the world. There's only one reason for that. We've got the Marcellus nearby. We just can't get infrastructure into New England. Think about the west coast of Canada. So on the west coast of Canada, we've got, and this is all tied to our sustainability goals. In the west coast of Canada, we've got the ability in Canada to move LNG, the cleanest and freest LNG in the world, to different parts of the world. 750 million people today have no access to electricity. 750 million people. And yet we're focused here in Canada on the 1.5% of emissions that we have. And it's about 20% in the United States. That's great. We definitely have to do that, and I think we're doing that. But unless we get LNG to the west coast of Canada, we can't do anything about the other 98.5%. And this is where we need a better alignment between what's going on in the United States and what's going on in Canada. So if you think about it, it was illegal in the United States in 2016 to ship natural gas out of the continent. Illegal. Today, it's the largest LNG exporter in the world, going to 28 BCF. Just think about it. You could not get an LNG facility built in Europe about a year ago. Germany built an LNG import facility in 8 months. You know how they did it? They changed the permitting and followed the leadership that takes. So unless we get the permitting right, we're not going to get to this position where we can take advantage of the advantages we have. I'm a little bit optimistic. The IRA in the United States, I think, really created a situation where we have carrots for the energy sector, and whether that's conventional or whether that's unconventional, to actually build some of this infrastructure, right? Now in Canada, I think we made some steps forward the budget last week, but it's still largely a stick environment. You know, beat the companies into submission. I don't think that's the way we want to go. We've got to find a way on both sides of the border to use carrots. John Adams works.
Isn't that what the IRA is?
Yeah, I think that's what the IRA is, right? So you've got incentive tax credits and you've got production tax credits, and that's creating opportunities. There are some changes that occurred here in the budget last week, but you know, one of the things I wish we'd been able to make more moves on, again, not a criticism, I think we're headed in the right direction, but it's going to be, and you and I talked about this earlier, it's going to be till the end of the year before we set a firm plan on how to make concrete efforts towards permitting. We've got to find a way to be able to do this bigger.
So I hear you say need for urgency,
Yeah.
action, and more policy certainty.
Yeah.
Let's pick up on that for Tracy, because of course when we talk about friendshoring, and you and I just did a podcast together, a little plug for the podcast, where you talked about growing up and seeing trains, and to you the trains reflected an economy in action. And now with friendshoring, it's going to require you to rethink to some extent how our supply chains are integrated here in North America. So how prepared are we in responding to this realignment and in terms of doing it in real time, because it's happening in real time?
It is happening in real time, Goldie, thank you. And I think it's more than just nearshoring. If you look at, you know, the global, what do we got, 30 years of globalization, and we've established some patterns, and the supply chains have been built from a capability and a capacity perspective to anticipate those patterns, right? So, you know, there's a good cadence to it and some consistency, and there's the odd kind of seasonality and surge, but we're all grown to expect it. But what's happened in the last 3 or 4 years is some tremendous shocks on supply chains. And it's COVID, you know, the rapid stop and the rapid start of volumes coming from different locations, and then it's the geopolitical events in Europe that caused changes fairly dramatically and quickly in flows of where people wanted to go with commodities and goods, both, North America and within North America as well as in the world, as we trade globally. And, you know, as we look forward now, you know, there's, as you say, nearshoring and some question on what the evolution of trade flows are going to be. You know, as we look at, as we heard this morning, as we look at Putin's relationship with China and the Taiwan question, if we look at, a lot of the production moving from Asia down to Southeast Asia, and what does that do to trade flows? And so I think, you know, from a supply chain perspective, without a doubt, we broke. But, you know, things are getting a little bit more consistent now. But as we look forward, what we expect of supply chains when they perform highly is going to be different. So we're going to need to be more flexible. We're going to need to be nimble. And we're going to need to have capacity to facilitate that flexibility. So as we looked at last year in the container crisis across North America, so no retailer wanted to be caught with empty shelves. So every single one of them, it seems, ordered in advance and ordered a lot, and we had a container gridlock in North America. You could argue it had impacts around the world. And as a result of that, warehouses filled up. Supply chains can do anything with enough time and notice, but supply chains, if something happens on one piece of the supply chain, it affects all of the supply chain. And so we started to have vessels coming into ports they'd never come into before. If you couldn't get into LA Long Beach, you might come into the Gulf Coast, you might come into Halifax, looking for the capacity and the capability to get into the country, which was interesting because we weren't expecting it, right? All the warehouses were full. This created different flows. And so as you think about going forward, I think this is going to continue because all those shipping lines who now aren't moving anything, by the way, because we got a ton of inventory in the system that we're slowly trying to work through, they now know that they can call on Halifax, or they can call on the Gulf Coast, or they can call on Vancouver, Prince Rupert, in addition to LA Long Beach. So the question becomes, what do we prepare for? What capability? What do we expect? And we're going to need more capacity. None of us globally can afford to have a lot of surplus capacity sitting around, just waiting in case, we need it. Economically, that's not going to work for any of us. So as we look forward, I think there's a couple of themes that are emerging. One is that supply chains need to be far more integrated. That's right up to production. So if we can get a better sense where trade flows are going, where industries see their markets moving to, so that we can be ready for it. You just heard Greg, it's not quick, it's not easy to get infrastructure in place, right? So we need to be working together both in the planning and the execution to make sure that we do that. On the execution side, I can tell you that when a container is being loaded in China, somebody knows where it's going. We don't yet. And so the supply chain is set up to operate too much separately in each piece as opposed to an integrated, organic kind of organism that can anticipate and can respond when there's issues. So we need to operate at a much more, and there's lots of data, there's technology that's going to enable that, but it requires the willingness to do transparent, kind of to open up ourselves from a planning and execution perspective. We need, number two, I got to tell you, there's so much work going on, but what comes out of policy, what comes out of regulation, needs to support what we all want. If we want these new high-performing supply chains and we want more capacity, the stuff that comes out of Ottawa or Washington has to support it. And just in this last year, since I've been in this role, we've had work rest rules and paid medical leave that sit on top of collective agreements that already have some of those provisions. We recently in the budget, it's a non-replacement worker legislation, it's interswitching. And the unintended consequences of all these things is they reduce the flexibility, the nimbleness, and the capacity of the supply chain. And so we have less capacity than we did 2 weeks ago. And so if we really are serious about this, then we got to make sure that we understand the impact and that what we are doing is supporting what we're talking about. So, and the final piece is a level playing field. We need the incentives and to invest in growth and capacity growing. I think all of us do, and I know that in the U.S. we've talked about it. They've done a little bit more than Canada. We need to move more quickly on these types of things.
All right, covered a lot of ground there. We'll come back to that. Now we've talked about some of the harder infrastructure in terms of pipelines and railways. Al, for many in the consumer audience, they don't think about sort of the digital infrastructure. They just want to make sure their computer works, their phone works, and their TVs work. You're at the intersection of global, finance economy, in the intersection of Main Street, if you will. The digital revolution is happening in real time, and you're seeing it take place. What are you seeing in terms of our preparedness and our ability to keep pace with the digital transformation, specifically as it relates to security, national security, economic security, in terms of cyber attacks, and the role that the public and private sectors can play in making sure that we're keeping ourselves safe?
Well, Goldie, thank you, and Daryl and Ian, thank you for convening this group. We're doing well, but there's still a lot of wood to chop. The pandemic was a game changer in terms of digital commerce. People looked at currency as being dirty, so cash digitization accelerated. Secondly, millions and millions of people around the world shopped for the first time online, and that becomes a very sticky experience as they realize how good it is. And thirdly, governments around the world woke up to the importance of digital in terms of how they can run their country from everything from giving out subsidies to people instead of doing it in vouchers, do it through electronic means or through debit cards or prepaid cards. In terms of reach, the United States and Canada, in terms of access to broadband, is at kind of 92 and 93%. In terms of speed of 5G, Canada has 5G available to about 75% of the population, the US about 93%. In terms of smartphones, which are the third critical element to digital commerce, it's about 86% level in Canada, 90% level in the United States. Visa and Euromonitor did a recent study of digital infrastructure and created an index, and the United States was second in the world, and Canada was 10th. South Korea was first. But there is work to do. In the United States, 40% of black households don't have access to high-speed internet. Only 63% of people in rural Canada have access to broadband internet. Only 43% of First Nations have access to broadband internet in Canada. So clearly work to do. And in the commerce space itself, we have to open up acceptance to more people. One of the things that we're doing is we're turning this simple cell phone into a point-of-sale device that doesn't require people to have telecoms built into their store. They can actually use this as their point-of-sale device to accept a credit card or a debit card or a prepaid card payment. We have to continue to work on resilience. To show you that we're in the infrastructure business, we have 10 million miles of fiber around the world. Every Visa transaction can route in 20 different ways because we use 3 different telecom systems and 4 data centers, and we can route to any of those depending upon what's happening at any one point in time. And that allows us to process 500 million transactions each and every single day. That said, there are 2 things that greatly concern me that I think we all have to work together, US and Canada, our governments, and in the private sector. One is fraud. Fraud is a huge, huge problem. Last year, we stopped $27 billion of fraud through our models and artificial intelligence and machine language that we use at Visa. But still, 7 cents of every $100 spent in the US and Canada is fraud. And that's an extremely expensive cost. The second thing is cyber. Cyber is a real problem. I have 870 employees at Visa who work solely on cyber. That's what they come to work each and every day to do. And the reality is that we're spending hundreds of millions of dollars on this and barely still keeping up. As my chief risk officer says, the bad guys are in a meeting like this at a better place with more people spending more money. Because the reality is they have access to the same technology that we do. And it's crazy, and I have this debate with the US government all the time. They want us to feed them all the information we have about cyber attacks and rogue nation issues, and we get nothing back. And to get somebody cleared at the level to get the access to the information takes months and months and months. I have 1 employee out of 28,000 who's sufficiently cleared to have the discussions with the US government. It's unacceptable. We have to work together to stay ahead of fraud and cyber.
So 2 things emerge as policy themes. I think one is the need for policy certainty, and the other is the connection to how capital forms. I mean, people in this room are, in many cases, responsible for the deployment of capital. They know that it is agnostic on ideology, and it's agnostic on nationality. It will go to where 1 can become 2. Are we competing in North America to attract that capital and to retain that capital to build this kind of infrastructure? First question. And then connected to that is, you touched on this a little bit, Greg, and then Tracy as well, but and also you, Al, is the connectivity between the relationship between business and government to be the solutions providers that I think our citizens expect us to be. How are we doing on that front?
Well, you know, it's interesting. I think about it from because I'm constantly thinking through this. So if we take policy, rhetoric, and capital, on a scale of 1 to 10, where are we? On rhetoric, on a scale of 1 to 10 on, say, energy
11.
transition. Yeah, we're 11 or 12, right? On policy, I think with the IRA and some of the moves by the Canadian government, we're moving up to that 3 or 4 range, right? On capital, I actually think we're maybe closer to 5 or 6. There's a lot of capital looking to be put to work. So if we can find the intersection between that rhetoric, capital, and policy, I think that's where opportunity sits, right? So that's a really constantly trying to figure out where that is. And it comes back to permitting. It comes back to things like interest rates, obviously important, but also comes to thinking, what's our geopolitical position in the world, right? Do we just want a perfect solution, or do we want a practical solution when it comes to infrastructure or energy? I'd go for the practical all day long, and I think the Russian invasion of Ukraine and all the terrible fallout of that show practical is the right way to go. I also chair a company called Mosaic, large potash and phosphate producer. If you control energy, you control food. You control food, you control democracy, right? So those three things I think we have to think about. And we're making some headway, I think, in both countries, but I think there's still a lot to be done on the policy front.
But it all requires it to be moved,
It does require it.
right? So Tracy, pick up on those themes.
There's a lot of energy, a lot of engines that are kind of ramping up. I don't mean locomotives, that too, but if you think about the energy markets that Greg's in, if you think about what's going on in the ag space in yields, but also crush and biofuels, if you think about critical minerals, if you think about all the investment going into electric vehicles, it goes on and on and on. This is all kind of coming and ready. But if we want to attract the capital, we have to have predictability. They need to know. The rules can't change. And we need to start moving really, really quickly if, as a continent, we're going to take our rightful place. And I'm very optimistic, as you know, about what is possible. But we've got to start grabbing it and doing it and stepping into it. So I think that's the opportunity, and it's also the risk if we don't do it.
Right. Al, you want to pick up on that?
Well, as the only U.S. person on the stage, I'll insult our own government. I am very concerned.
That'll make Evan happy, so that's good. Do something.
Very concerned about the lack of urgency about trying to get more competitive. People say we need to become more competitive, yet it takes 5, 7, 8 years to get all the permitting you need to build a manufacturing plant, depending upon the industry vertical. It's actually crazy. I'm hoping that the single biggest issue that Washington is united on is their disdain for China, that will potentially be a vehicle for allowing them to understand that if we're going to be more self-sufficient, we're going to be more competitive, that we have got to improve our ability to move forward with all the regulatory nonsense that gets in the way of making progress. And that has got to get broken down, and it's got to be dealt with in some urgency.
Right. Francis, I'm going to give you a chance to bring it home in the last 2 minutes here. Well, much of what we've heard about is competitiveness. We've heard about the need for certainty to invest and to grow our economies. As an economist, what have you heard? What advice do you have for our governments in how it is that we can both compete but also grow our economy at the same time?
In 2 minutes.
2 minutes. 1:51, actually. Keep going.
I'm going to come back to a point I made earlier, which is that we are probably in the next 6 to 12 months going to be feeling that competitiveness is not urgent. We're going to be feeling that rising unemployment rate is urgent. We're still going to be seeing really high food prices as being very urgent, and that's going to be the top piece on anyone's desk that's coming through. But as we've heard here, if we want to have sticky jobs, if we want to have capital that remains in the system, then we have to be focused on both the immediacy, but also curing us of some of these longer term challenges that exist. And we've heard many of them here across several different businesses. This is the urgency. This is it. We have to keep our eye on what will keep us strong and healthy for the next several decades, not just the next 6 months.
Right. So talk less, do more.
Sure.
All right. Well, look, on behalf of the panel, thank you all for paying attention, and please join me in thanking our panel. All right, off we go.
It's quick and painless.